Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me. And welcome to our seminar on social reproduction. It's been a couple of months since we've met. We typically meet on the first Friday of every month. And we've been busy over the past couple of months actually completing our project on the laws of social reproduction, hosting an end of grant conference, and screening a film based on our research, which has been visiting multiple cities in India and hopefully will come to the US and to the UK soon. So I'm really delighted to kick off our comeback with a book discussion of Vibhuti Ramachandran's brilliant new book. It's titled Immoral Traffic, an Ethnography of Law, NGOs, and the Governance of Prostitution in India. It's been published by Cambridge University Press in 2025, and it already has a book prize, which is just absolutely wonderful. It has been awarded the Joseph Elder Book Prize in the Indian Social Sciences. So many congratulations to you, Vibhuti, both on the publication of your book as well as the book prize. So it's really, really wonderful to have this occasion to discuss your book. As you may know, Vibhuti is Associate Professor at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Irvine, at the University of California in Irvine. And she's joining us from California. So thank you also for being up at a very early hour. And we're really delighted to be joined by a distinguished group of readers who have kindly agreed to comment on Vibhuti's book. First, we have Shimanti Dasgupta, who's Professor of Anthropology at the University of Dayton and is the chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work. And she's most recently the author of Prophylactic Rights, Sex Work, HIV/AIDS, and Anti-Trafficking in India. And we were really delighted to host her for a book discussion last year when the book came out. Next, we have Denise Brennan, who is professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Georgetown University, where she's also the faculty co-founder and co-director of the Gender Plus Justice Initiative. And she's the author of several incredible books. Her first book was titled What's Love Got to Do with It? Transnational Desires and Sex Tourism in the Dominican Republic. And her second book was Life Interrupted, Trafficking into Forced Labor in the United States. And she's currently working on two books. The first book is called The Border is Everywhere, Policing Undocumented Life in the United States. And the second book is Life Amidst Fire, Climate Change, Migration, and Work as Trafficking. Finally, we have Jennifer Musto, who is Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College, where she also directs the NAP Social Science Center and co-directs the Anti-Carceral Co and Laboratory. And she is the author of Control and Protect, Collaboration, Carceral Protection, and Domestic Sex Trafficking in the United States. And her current book project is titled Trauma, Misinformed Justice. And finally, we had Chaitanya Lakhim Shetty, who could not join us today due to bereavement in her family, but we're really delighted to have such a wonderful group of readers along with Vibhuti herself. So Vibhuti will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and this will be followed by comments from our readers. And we are also recording this session in case you wanted to share it with your colleagues and students. And it will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So I now hand over to Vibhuti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prabha, for the invitation, for hosting this. Thank you to Amy and Gail for their help in supporting and organizing this. And finally, I'm so grateful to the three wonderful discussants who are here today. I couldn't ask for a better group of people to be discussing this book. I have been reading and learning from all three of you, all four of you, including Prabha, since I was in graduate school, really. And so it's just such a pleasure to have had that opportunity to engage with your work and learn from it, read your work deeply, even as I was doing my field work. So thank you for each of your work. So in order to try to keep this within 20-25 minutes, what I decided to do was to provide a broad overview of the book. and talk about the overall questions, key interventions, introduce the research sites and the context, instead of getting into the specific chapters, because given that this was a multi-sited ethnography, each chapter has its own arguments as well. And so I'm hoping we can get to some of those through the discussion. And of course, I'd be happy to address them and sort of explore further in the Q&A as well. I will go ahead and provide some context to the book, which I know might be redundant to several people, especially in this group, including the audience who will be familiar with Indian law, but I want to make sure that I do provide that context to everybody. So I'll start introducing the book by talking about the cover. And by that, I mean the title as well as the cover image. So the title Immoral Traffic, as many of you would know, comes from India's anti-prostitution law, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, which was passed in 1956. It's a fairly early post-colonial legislation. It was passed within a decade of India's independence. And the book follows the way interventions against prostitution on the one hand and trafficking on the other intersect through the provisions and procedures of this law, particularly through the role of NGOs. And so the sites for the research were the sites that this particular law prescribes to intervene against prostitution and is also used by NGOs or sought to be used as an anti-trafficking instrument. And I'll talk a little bit more about those distinctions. And as for the image, I've provided the credits here so you can see it was not taken by me, but what it represents is something quite ubiquitous in metropolitan Indian cities, and I believe in many other metropolitan global South cities as well, from reading the work of other scholars. And these are mass indiscriminate raid and rescue operations, right, that typically involve anti-trafficking NGOs and police teams that go and remove women and girls from brothels or from what are construed to be brothels. And in the chaos of these raids, which I describe in the first ethnographic chapter of the book, there is no attempt made usually to ask or determine, which of these women are victims or survivors of trafficking, which of them might be voluntary sex workers. This is not something that's recognized at all in the context of these raids, and which of them may have a completely different account. So usually, all categories of women who are found there, typically the younger looking women, are taken out and taken in police jeeps like this one. So this is literally the inside of a police jeep. And it's really an inaugural moment, the beginning of a whole series of carceral interventions, right, from the police station all the way to, through the magistrate courts, different processes, which I'll talk about, and then eventually taken to what's known under this law as protective custody and is basically shelter-based detention of these women. And so the inside of the police jeep marks the sort of beginning of these carceral processes that are yet to come. And the reason these women have their faces covered in the image is because they don't want to be identified. They're trying to hide their faces from the media blitz that inevitably accompanies these raid and rescue operations. So could we move to the next slide, please, Madhuri? Thank you. So my ethnography was very deliberately multi-sited. As I mentioned, it follows the provisions and procedures of the ITPA law, but it does so across two different cities, New Delhi and Mumbai. And there were three main categories of sites that I observed, and I'll try to break it down a little bit as I talk through them briefly. The first are those raid and rescue operations that I was just talking about. In the chapter about the rescues, I compared two different raid and rescue operations. Both of them were led by NGOs as well as the police. One was in New Delhi, the capital, and the other one was in a smaller town called Meerut, which is a couple of hours outside of New Delhi. It was the same NGO involved, but there were two different police teams involved. And the contrast between these two rescues is that in the first one, in the Delhi one, there actually were some women who had been trafficked. And there was specific information about them that the NGO was acting on. And some of them did want to leave the sex trade. However, the post-rescue procedures brought to light the vast disjuncture between what these women wanted from their lives, the outcomes they wanted after leaving the sex trade, and what was being offered to them, the procedural bureaucracy, the paternalist prescriptions, etc. And so in that chapter, in studying raid and rescues, I observed, the interactions and the tensions between the women being rescued as well as the NGO and police team, on the other hand, but also the tensions between the NGOs and the police as well, because very often there is, especially in the critical literature on anti-trafficking, which I so admire, there is an emphasis on the alliances that are formed and on the collaborations, which certainly exist, which I also observed, but there's less work on the tensions on the ground between what the NGOs, perceive needs to be done versus what the police wants to do or is able to do. So that's what I track in the raid and rescue. Is happy to talk more in detail in the Q&A. The second category of sites were magistrates' courts. I spent 3 chapters on them just because there was just so much going on in these courts. And I observed these courts across Delhi and Mumbai. I observed 2 kinds of processes. So the first was more of a courtroom ethnography, where I spent time observing the trials of those who had been accused of facilitating prostitution and trafficking women. And so this included, pimps, madams, brothel owners, brothel managers. Typically, those were the categories. And those who had been accused of trafficking women. I didn't see any clients being prosecuted, at least in the 9 odd months that I was doing my research. And because of the awareness around anti-trafficking at that point, there was less use of the section in the ITPA that many of you would be familiar with, which criminalizes women for soliciting sex. So it was primarily these other categories that I mentioned. But I also got to observe a second kind of procedure at the court, which was in a different space. This was actually in the magistrates' chambers. I talk in the book about the process of gaining rapport in order to do that kind of research, because it was in her chambers, it was a judicial space. Of course, NGOs were allowed there, but me, not being part of an NGO, it certainly took a while to develop the trust and rapport to observe that process. But what that process was again, something mandated by the ITPA, and this is inquiries with rescued women, that is the women who had been removed from the sex trade and brought to this court. The magistrate was asking them questions in order to determine their custody and make a plan for their rehabilitation. These were all, at this court, they were all adult women, yet you can see the paternalism of the ITPA play out here, where the judicial magistrate is empowered to take these decisions. And NGOs were interestingly involved in this judicial process. That is also something that's prescribed by the ITPA, which specifically calls for respectable groups working on trafficking to undertake this process, right? So I got to observe that. Unfortunately, I also was asked to participate in it, and that's something that I talk about in the chapter. I'll talk a little bit more about my positionality before I wrap up at the end. And then the last site were these shelters, in one shelter in particular in Mumbai, the so-called protective home, which is essentially a prison-like carceral institution in the name of protecting women, keeps them under lock and key, prevents them from leaving, from meeting their family, from meeting their significant others, from making a living. And along with this form of protective incarceration, there's also these projects of moral reform and neoliberal rehabilitation that take place in the shelter. The sort of forms of alternative livelihood that are offered to these women that are absolutely not, economically sustainable. I think we've moved past the days of basket weaving as a prescribed solution, but certainly they were, being trained in sort of stitching and paper bead making and working in hospitals as non-medical staff. And so these forms of work, whereas a lot of the women many of them didn't want to leave the sex trade to begin with, right? But even those who had been trafficked and wanted to leave wanted something that was a lot more financially secure. So they would talk about wanting, for instance, a government job, a job in the municipality. Some of them would say, can you get me a janitor's position in the municipality? Because that is something that's secure. That's something that I can, take care of my family on. But none of that was, of course, offered to them. So those were the sites. Could we move to the next slide? Okay, so I wanted to briefly situate the book, both ethnographically and conceptually. I went over the sites, but within those sites, the book is really situated in the interactions and encounters between NGOs, Indian legal actors, and state agencies. So among these categories, and then between them and the women experiencing these interventions. So that's the meat, so to speak, of the ethnography. And conceptually, even though the immediate context of the book is the governance of prostitution, is the deployment of the ITPA, my broader interest is to place law and prostitution in this broader field of post-colonial and neoliberal governance in which a certain kind of NGOs play a very central role. Which I'll get to in a little bit more detail. So could we move to the next slide, please? Okay. So there are two main overarching questions that animate the book. The first one has to do with the interventions themselves. So the book tracks how the following frameworks, entities, and agendas intersect to govern prostitution in India. The first being post-colonial law and state practices. I already introduced you to the ITPA, which is central here. The second entity here and the second approach is the role of the US-led global anti-trafficking regime that has been active, especially since the year 2000. There have been other foreign entities also, in this space, for instance, the Nordic model, the Swedish model, certainly. But at the time that I was doing my research, it was really the US-funded anti-trafficking approach and the NGOs that are funded through it that was saturating these spaces. And then the third is anti-trafficking NGOs, who are typically larger foreign-funded, donor-driven organizations. So I'm going to talk about each of these categories a little bit. If we could move to the next slide. So let me talk about the two legal regimes at play here. I'll be as brief as possible in the interest of time. So in the Indian context, the ITPA, fundamentally at its core, there's an ambivalence around the figure of the sex worker, around what prostitution is. And I use the term prostitution, now as well as in the book, because that's the term that this law uses. And that was frequently cited in the sites where I did my research. But I use it with the knowledge, of course, that this is a heavily stigmatized term and morally loaded and has been aptly critiqued by sex worker communities. So there is this ambivalence around the figure of the sex worker. There are some provisions that criminalize the sex worker even for soliciting sex, but there are other provisions that treat sex workers as victims of sexual exploitation. And many provisions of this law are also sort of centrally about the immorality or the perceived immorality and indecency of prostitution in public places. And the US anti-trafficking regime, which really began with the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, there's less ambivalence there. Now, of course, even within the Indian law, there's no recognition of voluntary sex work, right? But there's ambivalence around these other things that I talked about. In the US anti-trafficking regime, there's this complete conflation of sex work and sex trafficking. Both these legal regimes have their own unique histories, genealogies, which I will not spend time on right now. Certainly, we can get back to it in the Q&A. But as a result of those genealogies and those particular actors and frameworks that have shaped these two regimes, I think both of them in parallel have, one set of approaches that is supposedly about welfare and humanitarianism, and another set of approaches that's deeply carceral. And these are both so entwined with each other. And so in India, the ITPA has this rescue, reform, and rehabilitation model that has its roots in moralistic and paternalistic social welfare approaches. Again, the histories of that are colonial, lie in moral reform projects, also lie in concerns around women labeled as abducted and destitute during the partition of India. So that's the longer history there. In the context of the ITPA, again, of the US regime, again, there's an emphasis on rescuing and rehabilitating these women. It's part of this broader humanitarian framework that Nicola Mai has called sexual humanitarianism, and it's transnational because of the US State Department putting so much money into globalizing its anti-trafficking agenda. And sexual humanitarianism essentially uses the policing of sexuality due to the moral panic around prostitution to institute its own kind of humanitarian or so-called humanitarian intervention. Right. But both these regimes also have deeply carceral approaches. So in the context of the ITPA, it criminalizes many different aspects of the sex trade, like I was talking about, including provisions against sex workers as well. But also it literally detains and incarcerates sex workers as well, right, through this protective custody and shelter detention. And in the US context, the carceral approach, and again, this is something that was there in the Nordic model as well. It's about arresting and prosecuting the alleged traffickers and encouraging the women who have been rescued to testify against them, right? And in 2 chapters of the book, I talk about how there's all of this emphasis on trying to get these women to testify, but in fact, the incidence of them, even in the case of those who've been trafficked, testifying to support the prosecution against the alleged trafficker is minimal. But I can talk more about that in the Q&A, so we can move to the next slide. Okay, so the role of NGOs is really central in bringing together, in suturing these two different frameworks, these two sets of intersecting interventions. I'm borrowing here from critical NGO studies scholar and anthropologist Mark Schuler, who uses the term gluing globalization. And so in the context of what I was studying, NGOs certainly seemed to be gluing together the post-colonial law and global sexual humanitarianism in service of the neoliberal aid regime. But it's really interesting. On the one hand, we talk about the contemporary NGO form in the neoliberal context, especially given the structural adjustments since the 1980s and 90s, right? That's the contemporary NGO form in India, as in many parts of the global South. And while much of what I observed certainly has to do with this relatively more recent moment, in the book I emphasize the long-standing role that NGOs have played within the ITPA, so within the Indian legal framework, right? And a specific type of NGO where the rescue, reform, and rehabilitation model really depends on NGO intervention. And so precursors to what we would see as a contemporary NGO form, including elite women's groups, non-state women social workers, in fact, helped to draft the ITPA, right? And there are specific provisions in the ITPA which depend on, again, the category of social welfare organization or non-state women social workers to assist with rescues and post-rescue procedures, right? So there's this longer history of interventions by NGOs. And then into that steps, the US-funded donor-driven anti-trafficking agenda. So as a result of that, what's been happening, what I observed in the context of my research is more rescue and rehab, right? So the larger scale now with more funding for the NGOs, mass rescues, more indiscriminate rescues, and then more emphasis on providing rehabilitation to these women who've been removed from the sex industry. But alongside, those processes that already were there on paper, there was much more emphasis now with the US model coming in on the prosecution of the alleged traffickers. There are provisions against that in the ITPA as well, but those were never really given the same kind of importance or sort of donor support as they started to get after the US funded NGOs started to work on this issue. And the kind of tasks under that included excuse me, training Indian police, prosecutors, and judges to identify, arrest, and prosecute alleged traffickers. So a lot of these training sessions. And then, as I mentioned, encouraging the women who had been rescued, often forcibly, to testify against alleged perpetrators. So we could move to the next slide. So I'm interested in these intersections of these different regimes and agendas and entities, not just for the sake of illuminating the intersections themselves, but as points of entry to a broader field of post-colonial and neoliberal governance. If we could move to the next slide. And that broader field really has a lot to do with the relationship between NGOs, Indian legal actors, and state agencies. It's in those relationships that the governance of prostitution is really taking place. And those relationships, as I mentioned earlier, previous studies and scholars have really emphasized the alliances and the collaborative aspect of them. And what I observed on the ground was certainly a great deal of mutual reliance among state and non-state actors here, but a highly contingent, delicate, and tense relationship, not always already in coalition or alliance, with deeply different perspectives and contested meanings around prostitution, around rescue, around victimhood, etc. The relationship between the ITPA law and NGOs is also at the center here, right? Because what it brings forth is, as I mentioned, long-standing reliance on and legitimation of a certain type of NGO, deemed to be doing respectable social welfare work, but also how NGOs rely so deeply on the law, on the ITPA, but also on other aspects in Indian criminal law. But at the same time, NGOs, using their new funding and power to stretch the scope and possibilities of their role within the ITPA, of what's possible in order to further these donor-driven anti-trafficking agendas. And what I observed happening on the ground is NGOs actually bolstering, right, and not weakening, but bolstering Indian state agencies and legal procedures, right? So in this neoliberal moment, state institutions and NGOs are deeply entwined and equally strong in bolstering each other. And here I want to acknowledge the work of feminist scholars like Jyoti Puri, who've talked about how the governance of sexuality, in fact, produces, and reanimates the state, right? So that continues to be the case. So there isn't a retreat of the state in that sense. But at the same time, NGOs are taking on tasks that they were not previously associated with, right? In India, so the previous association was more with this umbrella category of social welfare, the idea being, quote unquote, uplifting fallen women, etc. But now, with this US money coming in, NGOs are taking on tasks associated with policing, prosecution, judicial inquiry, like I mentioned earlier, and training Indian legal actors to implement and reinterpret the ITPA as an anti-trafficking instrument. Right, and so the book really explores the expanded and intensified legalities that this leads to, especially the labyrinthine procedural bureaucracy, the paternalism around these procedures, and the resultant harms on the women who are experiencing them. Could we move to the next slide? Along with the immediate context of prostitution, there were a couple of adjacent developments that were taking place during my research that thread through the book that I wanted to briefly mention. Because even though ostensibly they didn't have anything directly to do with prostitution, they were deeply consequential in the sites and procedures that I was observing. So the first is the infamous gang rape incident of 2013. So I did the bulk of my research in 2012 and 13. That took place in New Delhi, as everybody here would know, leading to this, major national reckoning around sexual violence and gender justice, newly intensified concerns around these issues, although, of course, Indian feminists have been working on this for such a long time. But at that moment, the kind of national conversations that were taking place that were often critiqued by feminists were asking for stronger laws, more convictions, a very law enforcement and criminal justice approach to sexual violence. And it had its impact even on, for instance, the court I was observing in Mumbai, which was an anti-prostitution court. It was a special court under the ITPA. But even there, so earlier, for instance, the court hadn't been necessarily collecting information on its conviction rate, gathering those numbers, crunching that data. But now the Maharashtra Judicial Academy was asking all courts that had anything to do with women's issues to start collecting that information. And in my chapter on the court, I actually talk about how that serendipitously helped me to actually get access to a lot of the judgments that I otherwise had to physically apply for applications for every time. So that was one. The other important development, which has only gotten so much worse since the time that I did my research, but it was certainly present even then, were what Megan Moody calls demographic anxieties around Bangladeshis, right? And in the context that I was doing my research, there were several Bangladeshi women in the sex trade, or several Indian Muslim women who were Bengali speaking and were suspected to be Bangladeshi. And the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim socio-political anxieties really impacted the way in which they were treated in these sites. So we can move to the next. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the interventions. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the women whom I observed, because my second question that really threads through the book is how do sex workers, or how do those labeled as sex workers, because several of them even denied being involved in the sex trade, how do they navigate these deeply punitive and moralistic interventions? So the women that I observed across all of these sites covered this vast spectrum in the accounts that they provided. Some of them said that they had been trafficked in the sense of being forced or deceived into being in the sex trade. Others said they chose it, often out of economic need. And there was a vast spectrum in between. There were several women in whose accounts there were elements of both trafficking and sometimes a return voluntarily to the sex industry. And many of the women that I encountered had been picked up in these raids and said that they didn't do sex work, but they were in the brothel, they were working there as a cook, etc. So, and then as I mentioned, it included Indian and Bangladeshi women. There are also some Nepali women, but for the most part, it was Indian and Bangladeshi. And the way that they navigated these interventions was extremely interesting. And in the different chapters, I track the strategic ways in which they narrated their accounts and identities to those in a position of authority. They selectively provided and withheld information and participation in these interventions. And, the book, as much as it pays attention to the accounts that these women provided to authority figures, I've tried to be equally attentive to the forms of resistance that I saw to these interventions, as well as to silences and denials and absences, refusals to show up in court, for instance, and escapes from the shelter in particular. So could we move to the next? I wanted to briefly touch on the vexed debates that we all know exist among feminists, among activists, between the anti-trafficking abolitionist perspective, right, and the pro-sex work approach, and where I stand within that. So I did not come to this research necessarily having much background directly on questions of sex work and sex trafficking. I came to it primarily as an anthropologist interested in law in the post-colonial state and in NGOs and the relationship between them. And so certainly the context that I was observing had to do with the sex industry, right? But my interests were somewhat different. And so the book is not, it's not an ethnography of sex work, right? It's not an ethnography of sex trafficking, or even of anti-trafficking interventions alone, right? Because I see how they intersect with anti-prostitution interventions and all of these other entities and frameworks that I've mentioned. So my focus, unlike the rich ethnographies of sex work, of the lived experiences of sex work that exist, the work of many folks who are here today as well, my work is not in that realm, right? It focuses on not the lived experiences, but on the encounters between sex workers and state agents, legal actors, and NGOs in these legal sites and processes, right? And so the ethnographic accounts that I report that go across the spectrum of coercion, choice, and denial were what women presented to authority figures, including to me, whom they saw as an authority figure. And I'll get to that, right? So I'm not, my book is really not about talking about the lived experiences of sex workers, because those were simply not the kinds of sites that I observed. These were not sites of sex worker collectivization or rights advocacy, unlike, again, the wonderful work that's been done on those other kinds of sites and interventions. These were sites where the women were working to produce the kind of accounts that they felt would, A, appeal to authority figures, and B, help them to get out of the court, out of police custody, out of protective custody. And again, I'm not invested in trying to, talk about the veracity of these narratives, but really the ways in which they were presented and perceived. Can we move to the next? I think I'm close to being done. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly talk about my own positionality in the field, which I think it's so important as an anthropologist. And to me, it's just as important as the insights of the ethnography. They're so deeply entwined with each other. In fact, that in each of the chapters, it was important for me in the book to talk about my methods as well as the ethical challenges that I faced and navigated as an anthropologist and as a feminist researcher, deeply critical of the kinds of interventions that I was getting access to observe. So by dint of class and gender and social hierarchies, right, my presence in the field was seen through the lens of respectability. It was seen as a legitimate presence in an otherwise stigmatized context. Again, I was not, studying sites where sex is sold, but even so, the stigma of prostitution, as I talked about in the book, spills over to these other, the kinds of sites that I was observing, right? These legal institutions. And so even those who were involved in these sites would often talk about that stigma and sort of being respectable, being legitimate in those spaces, which is of course highly gendered and moralistic. And so the way I was perceived due to my, my identity, my appearance, my speech, etc., certainly helped me to gain access to these sites. I spent a lot of time talking to lawyers, prosecutors, judges, police, NGOs, who unfortunately tended to see me as one of them. So that's not how I saw myself, right? Certainly. So this offered certain possibilities, but it also foreclosed others. And one of the biggest ethical challenges was that because I was always there by virtue of hanging out in these places, but because I was perceived as respectable, I was often put into the role of an NGO worker or, someone who could quote unquote counsel these women. And that made me deeply uncomfortable. And I talk about that in each of the chapters. And I made decisions at each point on to what extent I was willing to participate and sort of worked around certain expectations and made sure that I wasn't doing things that I was uncomfortable with, but it was never perfect, right? And I talk about those imperfections and those challenges. And and despite the efforts that I made to informally build rapport with the women who who were forcibly brought to these sites and who saw me also as an authority figure, I talk in chapter 6 about, for instance, using film screenings as a way of building rapport in the shelter. But despite all of that, right, I was still always already seen as an authority figure, and I think that's really important to acknowledge because it shaped the way everybody, all these interlocutors, whether it was the police, NGOs, or the women, treated me and what they said to me and what they didn't say to me. So I will stop there, and I look forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti. Over to you, Shimant.
So thank you. I actually have a little thing written down, and I try to keep time so that don't go over. So thank you, Prabha, for the invitation. And Vibhuti, it is truly my honor to be a reader at this book launch. I still remember the first time we met, I think at a AAA, when you were still in grad school, and I was just about an assistant professor. So again, my heartfelt congratulations to you. This book adeptly lays before us the complexities of institutional anti-trafficking work that operates at multiple levels and involves a multiplicity of actors, both state and non-state. The work is an insightful documentation of the discursive practices through which anti-trafficking work gains legal traction, is upheld as a moral calling, and perpetuates a larger anxiety about the lurking danger of forced, quote-unquote forced prostitution. Vibhuti delves into the maneuvers through which the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report, which I will be referring to as the TIP, that how it seeps into the interstices of a post-colonial nation state and a neoliberal nation state like India. Rather than simply arguing that the top-down imperial model, that is of the TIP, coerces nation states into compliance, which it does, Vibhuti also presents the detailed ethnographic data to show how especially anti-trafficking NGOs partake to adhere to the demands of the TIP. At the same time, and this is an important part of the book, at the same time, the ethnography also disassembles the larger geopolitical narrative where the global south is routinely blamed for failing to commit to anti-trafficking work. And the levels of the TIP where there are 4 levels, like level 1, level of watch, and then there's a watch list, and then India was degraded to a watch list. But this idea that nothing is being done in the global south, and Vibhuti actually has excerpts from the report to actually show how this is a constant, a routine kind of an allegation against countries in the global south to even try to stop anti-trafficking. So in the interest of time, I will actually focus on one issue that I think is key to Vibhuti's book and to anti-trafficking scholarship, largely speaking, that is the figure of the victim. The ideal or even perfunctory image of a victim of anti-trafficking is a brown or black woman, reliably from the global south, who looks rather hapless and calls us to do something. I do not intend to minimize victims of trafficking by any means, neither does Vibhuti in her book. However, what remains obscured in such images is how the victim is constructed and what constitutes victimhood. Vibhuti talks in length about victim witness testimony, which is considered fundamental to prosecution and conviction of traffickers. The testimony is deemed not only a matter of carceral justice, but is also thought of as cathartic for the victim herself. The NGOs involved in anti-trafficking and who get funded by the US, the State Department, and also others. One of the NGOs Vibhuti also mentions is a Japanese NGO. So the NGOs tend to use a two-prong approach that Vibhuti has identified in terms of ensuring victim testimony. First, they support the victim, which involves logistics such as providing them transport to the court, etc. But more importantly, also coaching them, teaching them how to foreground their victimhood in a way that resonates with and can withstand the prosecution, and finally move the judge to do the right thing, that is, convict the trafficker. The second one, which Vibhuti just also shared with us in her presentation, is training of police officers, judges, prosecutors, and others to implement the anti-trafficking law in a way that equated trafficking to prostitution on one hand, and resultantly that all traffickers need to be proportionately punished. I want to return to the first approach, that is constructing victims and victimhood narratives. So interestingly, as Vibhuti tells us in her book, and I will attest to this myself through my own work, that only 10 to 15% victims actually testify in a prosecutorial case. In a chapter that is, in the chapter that is titled "These Girls Never Give Statements," this is actually something one of the police officers told Vibhuti. So this chapter is titled "These Girls Never Give Statements." Vibhuti delves deep into not just why, but the how of this seeming conundrum. Well, one reason could be the hostility of prosecutors, where victims obviously feel nervous and they don't feel like they can actually speak. And I've seen that in my own work too. However, in presenting a specific case, that is the case of Sunita, a victim who did actually testify. Now, what Vibhuti does with this testimony is that Vibhuti underscores her victim testimony as an exceptional case, only to draw attention to the rest that actually don't testify. Those of us who work in the anti-trafficking realm know and understand the power of this reluctance that victims can and do embrace when confronting the legal system. This silence, as I too have argued in my own work, invites us to reconsider the figure of the victim. That she is not a passive recipient of imperial savior ambitions, and neither is she willing to slip into victimhood as a way to reconstruct and reclaim her life. Further, considering that the support for the victims after the case is closed is quite minimal, and as Vibhuti has shown in the case of Sunita, the woman who actually testifies, is marred in bureaucratic labyrinths. It took her months to get the 50,000 rupees as compensation. So it is not really difficult for us to imagine the reluctance of victims to testify. So what seems like a conundrum is, after all, a breakdown of a techno-legal apparatus which is inherently disconnected from the lived experience of the women who are inducted in the legal system, sometimes despite them not willing to be part of that system. I'll end with a quick final note, which is that the apparatus, that is the anti-trafficking apparatus, which is the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act of India, and also the Global Trafficking Anti-Trafficking Prevention and the US Trafficking in Person report, and they actually conflate trafficking with prostitution and leaves no room for sex workers, which is another very important impediment to migration, labor, and livelihood. And I especially appreciated Vibhuti bringing in the larger context of Bangladeshi women. And in the Indian parlance, oftentimes Bangladeshi women, who also I have encountered in my own work, are oftentimes, quote unquote, use the larger banner of the infiltrator. And the infiltrator is oftentimes a code word for Muslim immigrants who are often undocumented, but kind of brings us to the larger question of what Vibhuti is trying to do this work, is that this is not ethnography of sex work, it's not an ethnography of anti-trafficking, but she's trying to bring together what happens when a very marginalized, stigmatized community actually encounters the law, and also non-state actors, and also global actors, and how that all together offer this very, very rich venue for us to think about, like what that actually means. So taken together, While the global anti-trafficking apparatus constructs the quote-unquote victim in a certain image, the complex lives of the women on the ground infuse this image with necessary agency to dismantle it. And I'll stop here. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Himati. That was really wonderful. So next we move to Denise.
Thank you. My gosh, what a pleasure. It's so rare and glorious to celebrate, right? So, and to celebrate such a towering accomplishment of a kind and generous and just a huge thinker and colleague. So thank you. And it's just really great to be in dialogue here today with these amazing folks whose work I really admire. So I want to just start out, Vibhuti, about how I guess you call it the preface. I love how it opens. It's such a gift to young ethnographers and writers, but I think a lot of folks that are just, maybe documentary filmmakers, like people who are witnessing stuff and they just know it doesn't smell right. So I love how you start out, when you're like just a young person before formally trained in the academy, and you see these laws and there's just something wrong. And I think that's a really great invitation to young people to like continue to think about it and to maybe be an activist about it and to maybe get, more training. So it's I think you really open this as an intellectual history, and I appreciate that. And I think this is very teachable in that way. And I say that as somebody who teaches a methods class every fall. So thank you. I also, if I may, I just want to say that I think Sally would be so proud today. And I met you and Sally both and Prabha at the same time at a beautiful table that Prabha set. When was it?
I think 2013.
Oh, wow. Okay. And Vibhuti was a grad student, and yeah, this is just a little testifying myself here on as we're on the precipice of all funding and universities and academic sovereignty, being liquidated. That wasn't an inexpensive conference. Like, it required a lot of labor on the part of Prabha's colleagues, to bring us all together. And I loved that it was intergenerational. And look at where we are, the product of Vibhuti as sort of in her apprentice stage, right? Okay, so I have a meta question, and that is because back in 2013, there were a bunch of us writing ethnographies and some legal scholars, and then some folks who were, had been at ILO for ages and writing reports. And as we know, there was just like a flurry of academic production, activist concern, and for lack of a better word, the multinational or an NGO sector really focusing on trafficking. And that moment has passed. And so I think a big question, and I'm sure, and Vibhuti, we haven't discussed this, but I'm sure you were concerned, like, what does it mean to publish a book on trafficking? And in the title in 2025, when this isn't the issue du jour. And this is something that I'm thinking about as well, like writing now on how climate change, right, is, I'm arguing, like putting workers in conditions of coercion to work in extreme heat, wildfire, etc. And I'm like really wrestling with like, do I put trafficking in the title or do I just say work, work? So what I think you do with this book is, and your sort of, and long project of observing the world and critically analyzing it, is reminding us that funding imperatives come and go, and contexts, and academic and publishing house moments come and go, but God damn it, women's bodies have long been and continue to be a site of control, contestation, hysteria, and profit. And so we can see, this book I see, so anthropologists, I'm assuming probably not everybody in the audience is an anthropologist. And so we often say that ethnographies are a snapshot in time. And I'm starting to think that, particularly within this jumble of things that a bunch of us are writing about, the illegalization of undocumented individuals, the criminalization of sex workers, all kinds of crap that legal regimes cook up, and policies to limit women's control over their bodies, right? That these are not snapshots of time. This is the longue durée. And okay, so then that leads me to so what is ahead for those of us, living in places where we're like, oh my God, authoritarianism, maybe we never really had a democracy. And I think this work is like just such a beautifully written, reminder of, we know that that these carceral regimes are not new, they're not easily dismantled. There are moments of intensification and increasing, like it is real, that Trump is throwing a lot of money and creating like a lot more ICE agents, immigration customs enforcement agents. That's real. So there are moments of like more money put into these things. But let's not mistake like the period that you're writing about, or the Trump administration, or Hungary, or whatever, as exceptional in its like anti-woman, anti-migrant. So many of us here, and in the, let's just say the mid 2000s, when Prabha brought us together, we stepped away from working on trafficking after, even during, and I'm a US based scholar, so even during the Obama administration, we just, were losing our minds over losing the narrative, right? Still anti-migrants, still deportation-driven carceral treatment of potential trafficked individuals. And to be clear, there were as many deportations under the Obama administration, 3 million, as during Trump 1.0. So the thread that, I'm going to talk about a couple threads that we can see that do continue. And this is why I think these ethnographies that are snapshots in time cannot be dismissed as being that, just that, right? I think actually anthropology needs to start talking a little bit more about how we're like historians as much as ethnographers, but that's maybe for a AAA session. So one thread that has continued is not obviously just the use of militarized police muscle. and the injustice in courts and the forced rescues and the coercion that happens in what I don't know if this is the word, but shelterification. But I want to say that also the silencing and the muzzling of illegalized and criminalized people, so migrants, women, sex workers, is really, this one thread. And your chapter, so I was assigned the chapter on inquiries, the courts, and you really see it there, where there's expectations of a particular victim narrative, one that centers remorse, motherhood, and all have this like feature of, I was forced into this. So another thread that I see as reminding us that this particular period in time that Vibhuti is writing about is an exceptional, or, a lot of context in which we've all done research. So another thread is what is the long arm of what Janie Chuang, a US legal scholar, has called the US as global sheriff. And what I'm about to say is not an apology for or meant to soften the very real pressures of US foreign aid in various countries' policies, but I think that I see in Vibhuti's witnessing of anti-woman rhetoric and policy sort of a while ago, and before she was a formally trained anthropologist, and then of course her years of deep legal ethnographic research as reminding us that the Indian legal regime and need for victims was happening and going to happen regardless of, let's say, US anti-trafficking policy. So that leads me to my final point, which is an invitation to perhaps some of the younger scholars here to continue to use ethnography or deep hanging out and continue to use witnessing. And I'm thinking about witnessing in the sense of the real, like, arduous work that Vibhuti did of sitting in courts day after day. So to continue this as a form of data gathering that is dismissed as such, in the academy and other with other measurements, a la Sally, but to perhaps to work together. I think, I'm of a generation where we were it's very much a page out of this masculinist notion of the academy, like you need your single authored blah, blah, blah. Okay, jump through your tenure hoops, do that, but do work together. Vibhuti, Jenny and I have had the good fortune, right, of doing an edited volume together. And what I'm thinking is a way to push back on the delegitimization of ethnographic work as being just dismissed as just a case study, as, working together to show from different sites across the world all these threads, the same stuff and the same wine in different bottles, right? And then
వచ్చి ఆమె చెప్పున్నారు అది ఎప్పుడు చాలా తెలియ.
My final comment here is that as these sort of research teams or just co-witnessers, to really continue to sit with and wrestle with the criminalization of poor women, migrants, sex workers, but poor people, right? And we're going to see this continue as different authoritarian regimes, come and go. And to really focus on what Vibhuti, the tools at Vibhuti, the analytics of Vibhuti emphasizes about the need of someone to rescue. And it's so maddening that, those who actually may need some legal and social assistance, right, who fall outside of any kind of respectability politics or notions of like literal good citizens, right? They're not helped. I mean, this I think is it's just maddening. And then finally, right, just the reason, documenting the justification for having police, right? And playing with all these militarized, toys. But Vibhuti, thank you for giving us all a reason to be in dialogue once again, and to, I think, really going to inspire this generation coming up in the academy. And they've got their, it's tough, funding is cut for field research, and I think because your research is so there's so many different ways of that you've done research that you could now sit in a Zoom room and watch a court proceeding, and so it's a gift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. Okay, finally we have Jennifer.
Thank you, Prabha. And I'm mindful that we might be close to time. So I, like Shumanti, have prepared comments, but I also will watch for time. So we have also enough time for audience questions. So Prabha, too, full invitation to cut me off in the service of bringing in folks to the conversation. But first, let me just say thank you, Prabha and team at King's College London, who are not only facilitating our virtual gathering today, but giving us another reason and occasion, and there ought to be many, to celebrate this triumph of a book that is Immoral Traffic. And, some book talks might hew to a kind of critical variety. I just want to celebrate this work, and echoing something that Denise mentioned in terms of, you can learn a lot about a scholar from the acknowledgements, and the acknowledgements in this book are as generous and generative as they are reflective of the kind of colleague that Vibhuti is. And here I also want to just channel the person who brought us together, Sally Mary, Vibhuti's mentor, and also a long kind of brilliant mind who has shaped so much of the discussion today, and certainly in various critical trafficking studies scholars' work. So I am going to do a bit of a close reading today, and just to set the scene, my brief was to really tackle this notion of shelter detention. And not only is chapter 6 a rousing chapter with the most on-the-nose title to match, From House of Horrors to Sensitive Governance, the chapter and book more broadly traces the prescriptions and perversions of shelter detention in Mumbai, deftly interweaving ethnographic reflection with a genealogical mapping that, to bring in some of Denise's comments, this reads not only like the best of ethnography, but a kind of deep dive into a social history of laws. So Vibhuti, I don't know if you identify as a historian, but to me, this chapter came alive through your, meticulous, but also very nuanced reading of the laws that, kind of surround and have animated the ITPA. And so Vibhuti, just to set up more of the scene for readers, and again, please celebrate and buy this book, Ramachandran invites readers in chapter 6 to come alongside her in navigating bureaucratic warrens, dodging paternalistic tripwires, and unspooling the moorings of contemporary shelter detention that really dates back to the late colonial period. It's rare that a work that is so rich, that is so nuanced in its social history, can really capture the drama of bureaucratic processes. And so that to me was not only a model, but such an indicator for why we need to to pay attention to shelter detention, not only for its carceral punitive dimensions, more on that in a moment, but when we talk and code something as carceral, a lot of the stuff that surrounds it that is structurally injurious comes by way of delays, court processes that might be opaque. And I think this chapter gives those of us who study carceral incursions of the anti-trafficking or other varieties a legend for how to do that and do that well. So a few notes just about the framing that might take us beyond an explicitly Indian context. So though I'll come back to why it's important to very particularistic or very nuanced ways locate this within India. So to my anti-carceral feminist eye, and here by anti-carceral, I mean specifically prison abolition, not to be confused with neo-abolition of the anti-prostitution variety. I see a kinship to the shelter detention that Vibhuti describes linked to the ITPA as the kind of carceral protectionist schemes, and again, using that word perversions, that I tracked in my first book by the same name. And what was particularly impressive and generative to me is how Vibhuti situates her work, and more specifically shelter detention, within this emerging, and I'd say cutting edge body of ethnographic research, critical trafficking studies, critical carceral studies, and otherwise, that really locates the broad spectrum in which carceral anti-trafficking or carceral anti-prostitution strategies are taking shape. And maybe at the risk of stating the obvious, these schemes are ascendant. These schemes really belie, or rather are part of, I think, a really fascinating and troubling turn in the carceral expansionist regimes in various expressions therein. And yet, for me, part of the chapter, what it's really asking is a kind of two-part move. On one hand, let's not conflate the very specific social history and colonial legacy of the ITPA. Put more plainly, let's take seriously the laws, the regulations, the governance arrangements within India on its own terms without collapsing it or conflating it with US NGOized variants. But at the same time, we can look to see from China, Thailand, Nigeria, and I focus on Nigeria because to me, one of the pithiest theoretical spaces where Vibhuti's work really shines is when putting the chapter's ethnographic scenes and reflections in conversation with Stacey Vanderhurst's work in Nigeria, where like the detained women in Mumbai, Nigerian sex workers, forcibly rescued and put in these protective custody homes are subjected to protectionist, punitive, reformist, and rehabilitative strategies against their will. And so to me, like the both and of this book and chapter more specifically is holding how do we take the socio legal nuances of India and the ITPA seriously, and where and how do those types of carceral protectionist itineraries fit or maybe chafe in other ways in which carceral practices are really being foisted on women, marginalized, sex working, and within this kind of broader nebulous zone of potentially at risk and therefore subject to all sorts of NGO and state kind of collaborative or allied, even if in tension, ways of doing governance and doing punishment. So let me just say briefly, looking at time, a little bit about the reflection of the shelter itself. And to me, again, moments in this chapter where Vibhuti's research comes alive and shines is when she brings in the kind of side comments or the kind of, lapses even with some of the folks she engages with. So I'm thinking here specifically of the man that she asked for directions to get to this carceral outpost, and his response told us a lot of what she'd find. You mean the place where the ladies are caught and taken? Right? So kind of from the jump, the idea that shelter detention is a de facto prison. That shelter detention, in fact, from interlocutors she later connected with, I'm thinking here of Preeti, who is like, actually, this is worse than prison. And unlike prison, with the circumscribed sentence, and even in the best cases, although I know it doesn't always work out, some kind of set date of release, the surveillance, the punishment is indeterminate. And this is where, I'll be brief about this, but what I deeply appreciated and always love occasions to engage with Foucault, I wanted to push Vibhuti to say, yes, we can talk about Foucault, disciplinary power and governance, but what do we make of criminal legal and abolition, again, of the anti-prison prison abolition variety, who are asking us to say, in fact, in moments of kind of ascendant neoliberalism and the governance arrangements that happen, we can also see ways in which, the state in its carceral rehabilitative dimensions actually does worse stuff than kind of prisons and punishment business as usual. And my point here is just to say, like, there's a rich body of work coming out of the US, and I don't think we have to focus exclusively on the US, on the rise of the shadow carceral state, that actually says we can look to the seemingly non-formalized sites of punishment. Think here of mental or hospitals where people are compelled to go there, schools, these kind of spaces that are actually doing the work of carcerality, but they're not often coded as such. So that was maybe a way or a nod to say, let's keep talking and being in conversation and see what is happening, especially given your interest in the broader field of post-colonial and neoliberal governance. What is carceral creep, to borrow Mimi Kim's term? How is it happening, or is it happening in similar ways in India? I'm at the risk of being close to time. I have so much to say. As you can tell, I'm very excited. But let me just say, another space where Vibhuti's ever erudite, brilliant, and meticulous approach leavened a bit is when she talked about Bollywood films and the films as a way that in the field, folks like Ruby, Preeti, others who engaged in what she describes as a very explicit and purposeful politics and stance of refusal. These films, these videos, despite the superintendent's ask to keep it serious, became a touch point to really understand not only why Preeti and others liken shelter detention as worse than prison, but also ways in which, and I want to just channel the last, kind of piece that I think is really vital in this particular chapter, are the ways in which, the type of bureaucracy immobilizes and really suspends folks subject to these shelter detention in a kind of carceral liminality for which no actual remedy currently exists. So to say it otherwise, unlike a prison sentence in a US context, I'll use the context I know, there is at least in principle, even if not in practical action, some mechanism when the system gets it wrong. And as I was thinking about Preeti and Ruby and others, languishing in the shelter, I was like, what's the remedy when the state keeps them there indefinitely and all the while has their phone calls monitored, their interactions with each other and meaningful relationships surveilled, right? I think it raises some particular questions about carceral politics and practices when gendered race and certainly sexual scripts are ever present. So in conclusion, let me say, this is a triumph and brilliant book. It's the best of ethnography. I think it's a model for cutting and interdisciplinary work. And I think now more than ever, we need books like this to help us make sense of a most complicated carceral, I don't even know what to call it, scene of despair, but also occasion for us to really think about what resistance to it might include. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So I know we started a little bit late, so I'm going to give our audience, just an occasion to pose a few quick questions, and we'll stop in about 12 minutes or so, 12 or 13 minutes. Okay. So anyone with any questions or thoughts on both the amazing book as well as the comments from our readers? Maybe while we wait, Vibhuti, do you want to respond to anything that the readers have come up with? I think in particular, I think the question of, what do we do with trafficking, right? I remember meeting Sally in 2006 and she said, oh, it's all over. Trafficking is done and dusted, is what she had told me at one of the LSA meetings. But obviously, we're still here discussing it. So what has changed? I mean, a lot of things have continued, but what has changed? If you just wanted to, but I'm also happy for other people to pose their questions while we wait.
I'm happy to respond to that. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. I know even for the East Coast folks, it's pretty early in the morning still, so I really appreciate all of you and your scholarship and just being in conversation with you and hearing you engage with the book. Kind of that's always the best part, right? What people are, how people are reading the book. So thank you so much. About what do we do with trafficking and why trafficking today question? I think there's just so much there. The reason for my book in particular, the reason I retained traffic in the title was, of course, the ITPA itself, right? Because it saturated these spaces, right, just as much as the anti-trafficking regime did. But the interesting thing there is that even though the Indian law uses the term traffic in it, the ITPA law, it doesn't actually define trafficking. Now, since I did my research, of course, most people here who work on India would know that there's new, there was an amendment to the criminal law, as well as now in the last few years, efforts to draft anti-trafficking bills that are more specific to trafficking. But in the ITPA, the interesting thing is that even though trafficking is signified in the title, nowhere in the law does it actually define trafficking, right? It's really a law all about curbing prostitution. And so I think that irony is something that I wanted to foreground. And the social history of the ITPA as well as NGO intervention, through this law is something I wanted to foreground. But to Denise's other question too, and to what Prabha was saying, is it really done and dusted? I mean, the yes and no of it, right? I mean, so many of us in the context of the special issue that Denise was talking about, we've been thinking so much about sort of post-truth politics, right? And the role of the moral panic around trafficking, in the MAGA world, for instance. And I mean, now too, right, the political discourse right now, I mean, the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga and, who's implicated and how are they implicated. And this is a regime where in the previous Trump administration, it was all about like, let's end online sex trafficking, right? So this is an administration which has in the past sort of set itself up as some kind of an anti-trafficking warrior, deeply invested in quote unquote saving girls and women. American girls and women from online sex trafficking, and now, there's all of this sort of denial of, associations with Epstein, etc. So it's very much alive, right? And even in a political moment, that's where there's so much that's been going wrong. I mean, trafficking is playing into it in these very interesting ways. So I think it sort of lends itself to a certain kind of political posturing and denial that's in itself quite fascinating, even outside of the immediate context of the sex industry or of other forms of trafficking. But yeah, it's a very generative comment for sure.
Yeah, go ahead. I think Pankuri and then Shruti.
Hi, Vibhuti. Congratulations on your book, and such a great panel to listen to. Like, it's a dream panel for anyone working on trafficking and sex work. I've only read one chapter of your book so far because I wanted to also cite it somewhere. But I had a question regarding caste and if caste of workers, like, because you go through so many sites, right, and you talk about power and like Jennifer, Denise, and Simanti rightly said that this book is much more beyond an analysis of the trafficking and sex work law. So you talk about magistrate court, so it's so useful to actually teach as an example of also ethnography, legal and social legal ethnography. So I was wondering, while doing those observations in courts and other sites, as well as while following the rescue and post-rescue process, if caste was something that you were able to observe or engage with in your writing in the book or elsewhere, and how that sort of factors into your analysis of post-colonial law and how that interacts with global sexual humanitarianism that you discussed in one of the slides as well in your presentation. Like if you have any thoughts on that at all.
Can I quickly also invite Tripti to pose her question, and also then you can respond to Shruti, Tripti, and Pankhuri. Thank you. Go ahead, Tripti.
Yeah. Hi, Vibhuti. Thank you so much for the book. I'm going to order one. It's going to be very useful for our work. I had two questions or observations. One, I was curious because, in the 80s and 90s, the narrative around trafficking and prostitution in India used to be this obsession with Nepalese girls and women, and so much literature on that. And there was a kind of a image of these very vulnerable young girls who come and then they're sexually exploited. And I noticed what you mentioned, and then Simanti also reconfirmed about this shift towards Bangladeshi women. And they're not seen in the same way as weak, vulnerable women, but as Simanti said, as infiltrators. So I'm just wondering, like, what is this sort of, a different direction, a different sort of like the politicization of sex work and trafficking, if you could comment on that. And second was, from your experience of observing court inquiries and the rescue and rehab question, how did we reach this place where everyone's obsession, including the legal actors, the judges, the prosecutors, everyone else, the obsession became, where does this woman come from and where will she go, rather than plain and simple right to liberty, which is fundamental as we learn under the Indian Constitution. So yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Vibhuti. Thanks.
Actually, great. And Shruti,
yeah, I just thought, since others have spoken their question, and I thought maybe my question is not very well worded. I was just wondering, so I have been part of this, I've worked on this issue as a litigation lawyer in the trial court, in the Supreme Court, in the so-called public interest litigation space, but also as, as a part of a US donor, I had supported work in DMSC. And to what Pankhuri said, I had, I remember when I went to DMSC, because I supported DMSC for their Supreme Court case, they told me that when women in DMSC they don't identify with any religion, and they don't carry surnames. And I was I thought that was very striking. But I was wondering, I never looked this up, where does this word moral come from? And did you go, I haven't read your book, I'm not yet to read it, but I was wondering, where did they get this word moral from? And what are the other similar countries of similar era? What did they call their laws are they similar, parallel kind of things? I'm just wondering. So yeah. Thanks. Thank you. And this was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you, for your questions. Since we are running out of time, I'll keep it as brief as possible, which means that I may not do justice to all of the questions, but I'll try to speak to them as much as I can. So Pankhuri, the question about caste, as those of us who work in South Asia know, very often the way that caste manifests and plays out is often implicit, right? More so than explicit. It is read from, your last name. It's read from your appearance. It shows up in interactions in ways that are not necessarily named as caste, but as part of a social hierarchy in which caste is deeply embedded, right, which caste shapes. And so in the interactions that I observed, between NGO workers and magistrates and of police inspectors and the women, this social hierarchy was very much there, right? It shaped the very top-down ways in which these women were spoken to and in which their stories were heard or not heard. And so I think the more explicit bias and discrimination where people very overtly said something about identity was much more around the Bangladeshi women and the anti-Muslim kind of aspect of that, and the anti-immigrant aspect in particular. Shimanti mentioned the term infiltrators. I heard the term illegal all the time, right? And so that was much more explicit, and I would say caste was more implicit. People's last names were sometimes known and sometimes not known, and that also is not in itself always an indicator of caste identity. So I know that's not quite a direct answer to your question, but that's how it played out in these fields. The question about, thank you, Tripti, for your questions. It's good to see you after, I feel like I met you during my fieldwork. It's been so long. Questions around Nepali and Bangladeshi women. I think it's, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, it is about the politicization of this issue, right, of trafficking. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about the US context and Epstein and, Trump. Again, in the Indian context, right, given the sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, which has very tangible now manifestations since I did my research with the CAA and NRC and all of these forms of legal and not just regulation, but really the criminalization of the Bangladeshi migrant, right? So I think there are ways in which the sort of socio-political regime of the time really infuses its particular anxieties, its particular biases into the issue of trafficking, which is such a sort of broad issue. That has often been vague enough to pin on to various other issues of the day. And so I think that's why again, the issue of Bangladeshi women got so much importance during the time of my research, because that was, again, like 2000. I started it in 2010 and then all the way to 2014, and in those years it was amping up every few months, and now has blown out of proportion, right? And the second question about the obsession with where these women should go and what is to be done with them, and instead of thinking about their liberty and as constitutional right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know several critical legal scholars have commented on this, especially in the context of shelter detention, but also the ITPA more generally. And I think, again, I'm not a historian, although yes, I have engaged in some social history in this book. But I think what I found the most fascinating here is actually the connection to the partition and the way in which the concerns around women who were labeled as abducted and destitute played out. Because remember, the partition and the drafting of the ITPA were just about 10 years apart. And of course, the ITPA has other genealogies, right, in colonial legislations as well, late colonial legislations in particular. But what's really interesting, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, I also would recommend reading Rohit Dey's work on this particular question, where several of the women legislators were actually common across both these issues of dealing with the women in the context of the partition and drafting the ITPA. And so those concerns, those historical concerns around restoring women to the familial fold, and the state taking on temporary guardianship, or if the familial fold as defined by the state cannot be found, then the state sort of acting as parens patriae. And so that is something that one saw in that moment of the partition that echoes through and has its legacy in the ITPA as well. I mean, that's just sort of one genealogy, but I think it's an interesting one. The question about where did the term immoral come from? And I think Again, I'm not an expert and I haven't studied the other post-colonial contexts directly myself. I've only read about them through the work of other scholars like Stacey Vanderhurst, as Jennifer was mentioning, who works in Nigeria. But I see a very similar colonial legacy in all of these different, post-colonial contexts of the former colonies, the legal history of the empire being common, where prostitution was essentially, I mean, there are many different concerns around prostitution, right? The Contagious Diseases Acts, the concerns around white slave traffic. There are many genealogies here, but I think one of the themes that threads through the precursors of the ITPA and the ITPA is this question of the threat that prostitution is seen to pose to public space, right? And so there are, for instance, in the ITPA, there are sections that criminalize prostitution within, is it 100 meters or 200 meters? I think it's 200 meters of a public place, right? So it's all about, we don't want this in our cities. We don't want our cities polluted and corrupted by the immorality of prostitution, right? And that's such a different history and genealogy, despite having a lot of overlap with the US-led and sort of globally prevalent anti-trafficking regime. So I'll end with that, but of course, there's a lot more to unpack.
Great. Thank you so much, Vibhuti. I think we're out of time, and it's been truly a pleasure to read your book and to discuss it. And thank you for this wonderful gift. And congratulations again. And thank you to Shimanti, Jennifer, and Denise for coming together. And I know that Sally would be very proud of you. And we fondly remember her for her mentorship and for inspiring all our research. So thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much. I'll quickly add that she was such a model for, doing conventional legal anthropology, paying attention to the micro practices of legal institutions, but then also thinking about these regimes of global governance. And, that's where so much of my inspiration has come from. But again, thank you to all of you on the panel. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.